Totally.
All right, welcome to Mobilizing Funding for Climate Resilience. My colleague Meg and I and our esteemed panel are very excited to talk about resilience, to talk about nature-based solutions, but I think most importantly to talk about the unprecedented levels of funding that have entered this space in the last 4 years. These levels of funding may be something that we never see again. Hopefully not. Hopefully they will continue. And we're going to touch on 3 things. Climate change is real. It's here to stay. The increased frequency and intensity of storm events has devastated many communities and left other communities very, very vulnerable. And swift action is needed to address these vulnerabilities in the face of climate change. And for those of you who have been in this industry for a while, I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces, and the familiar faces that I see have been in the industry for a while. Over the last 10 years, you've seen a major shift from compliance-based products, 404 mitigation, moving into water quality improvements, moving into carbon credits, and a major shift toward nature-based resilience, where a lot of the compliance has sort of taken a back seat, and the nature-based resilience has taken a front seat. So we're really excited to talk about these things and to talk about money. Money for implementing nature-based solutions. So?
Yeah, thanks for setting the stage, Brett. So we're going to be talking mostly about the federal funding that's available right now for climate resilience. We're going to give a brief presentation, and then we're going to interact a bit with our panelists to get their take on these issues, and then open it up for some audience Q&A. So we just want to start out by introducing ourselves as your presenters and moderators. I'm Meg Wickless. I'm a project development manager for Greenvest. It's kind of a vague title, so a lot of what I do is putting together new nature-based projects, whether it's for resilience or water quality or habitat restoration. And a really big piece of that is identifying and securing the funding to get those projects in the ground. And I've been in that role for about the last 4 years.
I think you're being a little modest, Meg. Meg does most of our grant writing and does a very good job, and we'll talk a little bit about the success of that later in the presentation. I'm Brett Berkeley. I'm Senior Vice President of Greenvest. I'm one of Greenvest's principals. I don't really know what I do every day anymore. I wear a lot of different hats. I think the value that I bring to the table for Greenvest is in thought leadership, project genesis, the development of effective public-private partnerships, and identifying and securing and aggregating funding. And I just try to run as fast as Meg does every day. So why don't we give you a little bit of an introduction to Greenvest. Greenvest is a principal developer of ecological assets. We've been around for about 30 years. Everything we do is land-based. What is, I think, most interesting about Greenvest, and there are other companies here who do the same thing, is that we are fully delivering nature-based solutions, and we are accepting the performance-based risk and the financial liability that goes along with fully delivering these types of projects. Meg, do you want to tell everybody a little bit about why we're here today and why we're qualified to be here today in terms of what we're talking about?
Sure. So one of the main reasons we're here is because Greenvest is the implementing partner for the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative, which is a large coastal resilience program in Baltimore City. Greenvest is the implementing partner, and we're using that as a bit of a case study today to draw examples from and discuss, because it's a really good example of how to successfully aggregate and mobilize funding for resilience. And apart from just the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative, Greenvest has been working for the last 30 or so years in very innovative spaces throughout the Mid-Atlantic, using innovative contracting and restoration approaches. So we thought we'd pull together a panel and tackle some of these issues.
And we're going to talk about some of them today. So why don't we talk a little bit about what the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative is?
Oh, let's introduce our
I'm
panelists.
moving too fast. We have to introduce our panelists.
Yeah.
Sorry, Meg.
Yeah, so first, I just want to discuss why we decided to hold a panel on this topic. So any eligible grantees that might be going after these federal funds are all facing the same challenges when applying and mobilizing funding. And figuring out the solutions to those challenges is going to take collaboration from diverse sectors and diverse perspectives. So we wanted to gather some of those individuals that have those perspectives today. Another common thread between all our panelists is they are all somehow involved in the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative. So I will go ahead and turn it over to each of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves.
Cool. Well, thank you. I'm Liam O'Meara, president of EQR, Environmental Quality Resources, and I'm very happy to be here today. I am a contractor, implementer of ecological restoration projects. And first of all, I just want to say thank you for including the contractor. Despite all evidence to the contrary, we do have feelings, and we like to participate in these things. So I'm very happy to be here to talk about the construction process. I also run a trade group for ecological restoration businesses called CWRP, Chesapeake Watershed Restoration Professionals, and we are a coalition of businesses that do ecological restoration in the Chesapeake watershed. We've come together because we recognize that this industry needs a voice and needs a part in this process. And very happy to speak about that a little bit today as well. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Cole. I'm a partner with the firm of Perry White, Ross & Jacobson. We're a government relations firm working with both state and federal partners on projects like these. Oftentimes I describe my work as a professional hand holder and translator. And what that means is that for these type of very technical projects with many different partners at the table, a lot of times you need to translate for elected officials what you're doing, what the background is for that, what the precedent is for that, and then hand-holding is just taking Brett's calls whenever he needs to talk things through.
Hi, I'm Brad Rogers. I'm the Executive Director of the South Baltimore Gateway Partnership. On this panel, you can think of me as the client. We're an economic development authority working in neighborhoods across South Baltimore, funded primarily by casino revenues from local casinos. We've been able to leverage those casinos into what's now a $67 million shoreline restoration project. So it's been very exciting to work with this team.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Fretwell. I work at Maryland Department of the Environment. We're essentially the Environmental Protection Agency in Maryland. The group I'm with is the Water Quality Financing Administration. We manage grant and loan funding for water and sewer projects, green infrastructure projects like we're talking about today. My group manages the state revolving funds, clean water, drinking water state revolving funds, as well as some state funds, the Bay Restoration Fund, the Comprehensive Flood Management Grant Program, and then a couple pay-for-performance programs, the Clean Water Commerce Program, and the Susquehanna River Basin Conowingo WIP pay-for-performance program.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jessie Delph. I work for the Maryland Department of Emergency Management. I'm a Senior Hazard Mitigation Project Officer. My role in this is our hazard mitigation team helps local jurisdictions and eligible applicants secure funding for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities grant. That is what Grant has partnered with this project specifically. I also help secure funding for the hazard mitigation assistance funding in general. So there's like 3 different funding streams from FEMA that I help local jurisdiction and entities secure funding for hazard mitigation projects.
Great.
Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, everyone. Before we move on, I want to jump off of one thing that Jessie mentioned. She was mentioning eligible applicants for these programs, and we know that not a lot of people here today are probably technically an eligible applicant to receive federal funding, but I'm sure everyone here works with eligible applicants, whether they're local governments, nonprofits, or academic institutions. So even though we're not all necessarily applying for these funds directly, I think this applies to everyone in this room. Brett, do you want to take us through an introduction of the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative now?
Can I talk about the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative now? I'm just excited about the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative. So the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative is the largest coastal resiliency program in the state of Maryland. It's ultra-urban. It is a multi-stage, multi-phased program with multiple individual elements that are comprised of nature-based solutions and some gray infrastructure because of the ultra-urban location that it sits in. The outcomes that will come out of the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative include significant water quality improvement, enhanced ecosystem and community resiliency, which is perhaps the largest focal point, and the enhanced ecosystem and community resiliency is going to protect several critical lifelines, including a hospital, a liquid natural gas plant, power generation facility, and a lot of critical highway infrastructure and evacuation routes. There's going to be a massive restoration of lost aquatic habitat to the tune of almost 50 acres of aquatic habitat reestablished along 11 miles of ultra-urban shoreline. And perhaps one of the greatest benefits, and I will thank Brad for actually lifting my gaze from the water to the communities that this program will benefit. The environmental justice benefits from this program are off the chart and include connecting low-income communities of color with nature, with recreation and restored green open space, which over the last 4 years has proven to provide some pretty incredible health benefits and improved quality of life. Meg, you want to talk about money?
Sure. So, as Brett was saying, this is a massive program with multiple stages, multiple projects. So it's funded currently through a variety of sources, local, state, and federal. We threw them up on the screen here. And this list doesn't include other pending funding applications that are still waiting on notification of award or applications that are still in development. And because of the scale and the expandability of this program, Greenvest and South Baltimore Gateway Partnership are kind of in a constant cycle of identifying and applying for more funding so that we can keep building this program and take advantage of the funding while it's available.
I think there are 3 key points that I'll add. What has lent to the success of the program, first and foremost, is a very strong partnership between Greenvest and South Baltimore Gateway Partnership and the community and the local and state government entities that have been involved in promoting the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative. But when I talk about the partnership between South Baltimore Gateway Partnership and Greenvest, and this is a point that we'll make later, it's Brad Rogers' vision in recognizing what efficiency the private sector can bring to the table and how he can leverage that efficiency to drive this program forward. I think perhaps the most important part of this is the hard work that you've done over the last decade to not only align the community, but educate the community to how important these environmental amenities are and what they mean to improving local quality of life. And of course, it's always easier when the money comes in. So we've had a lot of success over the last 3 or 4 years in particular, and we've been able to leverage upon that success. So we've got some eye-opening statistics for you that will underwrite some of the points that we opened with in terms of the reality of climate change and the devastation that climate change has caused in vulnerable communities. You'll see a line graph here, which is demonstrative of the exponential increases in frequency and intensity of storm events. Meg, why don't you start with the honor that we can give to 2023 as it relates to these storm events?
Sure. So the honor that Brett is referring to is 2023 saw 28 separate billion-dollar-plus disasters and is now in the first place for most billion-dollar-plus disasters of any year since 1980 when NOAA first started tracking these statistics. Unfortunately, it's not an outlier. The average number of disasters per year and the associated number of damages has been steadily increasing throughout the last 3.5 to 4 decades, as you can see in the table. And as Brett was saying, the line graph you can see in red, that's showing the number of billion-dollar-plus disasters in 2023 versus the line in black, which is the average number of disasters per year from 1980 to present, which is around 8.5.
Right, it strongly illustrates the problem, for sure.
So with this reality of climate change, the federal government has recognized that resilience for our communities and our infrastructure is a major priority, and that green infrastructure can be a really great tool for achieving that. So Brett, could you run us through a bit about the shift from this gray to green infrastructure?
Sure. I mean, the first thing that I'll say is nuisance flooding and even catastrophic flooding across the United States is tied to stormwater management. The lack of stormwater management, aging and failing stormwater management infrastructure, absent stormwater management infrastructure. And, even as recent as 30 years ago, the solution was to put it into a pipe. So there were gray solutions and gray infrastructure, and that was how we were dealing with stormwater, and in large part, it's how we were dealing with resilience on the coast with bulkheads and rock revetments and things of that nature. So one thing that I'll highlight is that Hurricane Sandy happened in 2017. I had the unfortunate experience of living in New Jersey at that time, in Jersey City, and watching people in life rafts on Washington Street in Jersey City as the sewer system backed up. So the state of New Jersey and others commissioned a study to look at the value of coastal wetlands in the state of New Jersey, and this particular study concluded that there was at least $625 million worth of prevented damages because of the amount of green infrastructure left in the state of New Jersey. The problem is that green infrastructure is drowning. These tidal marshes all across the state of New Jersey are drowning. New Jersey is one of the most urbanized and populated states in the country. These systems are sediment starved, and they're disappearing. So that, I think, underwrites this shift in focus from gray infrastructure to green infrastructure and some of the importance of green infrastructure, which I know you'll talk about in a second, Meg.
Yeah. And we pulled some other numbers that underwrite that shift from gray to green infrastructure from a report from the Nature-Based Infrastructure Global Resource Center that showed that nature-based solutions can be up to 50% cheaper than their gray infrastructure counterparts and add 28% added value through co-benefits like water quality, carbon sequestration, environmental justice, et cetera.
I'll just caveat that I think that the co-benefits on a percentage basis could even be higher, especially if these projects are designed and implemented properly. The cost tends to be more variable and situational. So it depends on where you're located. It depends on the logistics of the situation, access, and typically when you're working in more rural spaces with better access and less logistical constraints, the cost can go down. When you're working in an ultra-urban environment like the outer harbor of the city of Baltimore, the cost can be a little bit higher, but in all cases, you are able to generate these co-benefits, Meg. That's correct.
Yeah. So with this recognition that we really need to make our communities more resilient and this shift from gray to green infrastructure, that has manifested in several federal programs being available to fund nature-based infrastructure for resilience. And we've put some of them up on the screen here. I should note that these programs don't exclusively fund nature-based resilience, but it is an eligible activity under each of these programs. And in red, you'll see the levels at which each of these programs was funded in its most recent funding cycle, whether it was 2023 or 2024. And you can see this is a huge amount of money. A lot of this was made possible through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, which combined are nearing $1 trillion of money that needs to be spent. And the caveat of money coming from these programs is that it has to be spent within a limited amount of time. So for the IRA, that's by 2031, and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, 2026. So you can see how there might be challenges in converting all of that money from well-funded grant programs into actual projects in the ground. And I think Brett is going to run us through what some of those challenges are.
I will. And before we come off this slide, there's one other point that I'll make, and I think that Jeff Fretwell and Tom Cole may get into this a little bit. I'll call it companion legislation, and I think Maryland has demonstrated a tremendous amount of thought leadership in terms of legislation with things like the Comprehensive Conservation Finance Act, which have now written into law a method to procure pay-for-performance services. And I think that's tied to something we'll talk about later, which is some of the value that we think the private sector can bring to the table in terms of how we can spend this money efficiently and effectively. Okay, so what we have on the screen here are four main elements that are all very closely related to one another. And this is going to help us think about how we might be able to spend this money. And we'll tell you guys a little story as we refer back to these elements. And I think where we'll start is time and capacity. These grants take a tremendous amount of time to prepare. So Greenvest and South Baltimore Gateway Partnership, or I should really say, Brad, you dragged us into writing a brick grant. And it was the first iteration of the BRIC program in 2021. They were the first applications that were submitted to FEMA. And when we talk about time, Meg, why don't you talk a little bit about how much of your life you spent writing this BRIC grant?
Are you done yet?
Thank you, Brad. No.
Sure. So I probably spent 100% of my time for the better part of 2 months writing this grant, not including like probably a 6-month build up to that intense period of just grant writing. And that doesn't include all of the hours spent by Brett and other Greenvest staff and by Brad as the applicant and engineers and consultants that were helping out on the project. So it was a huge amount of time spent on this program. And as someone who part of my main job is grant writing, I had the luxury of being able to set aside other things that I had to do to solely focus on grant writing. But a lot of the applicants to these programs don't have that luxury or don't have a contractor that's able to provide that. And so for some of these applicants, if they are able to set aside time to write one of these grants, it's probably going to be the only grant application they could submit all year because they just can't set aside that time over and over again to keep writing applications, even if there are 5 to 10 programs in a year that could help them fund eligible projects that they have.
Right, which also gets a capacity. I think, and I will say what got us over the hump is that Meg had a terrible case of COVID right in the lead up to the submission of the application. So you had a little bit more free time to help finish the application and get it submitted. Mm-hmm. But Greenvest alone spent over 3,000 hours preparing this application in a 3 or 4 month period, despite the 2 months of lead up. So if we talk about time period overall, and this will again relate back to capacity, we're looking at a six-month project development before we even knew about the BRIC grant, and then about 6 months to prepare that BRIC grant. And then we go ahead and submit it, and we got an initial notice of award about 14 months later, and then we had to go through the negotiation process, and some of the innovation we'll talk about, actually Jesse Delf will talk about, in terms of how we had to rewrite the contract agreement between the state of Maryland and FEMA to address some of the more innovative contract requirements. But so we get to an award at about 24 months and we start working. Right, it's another 14 to 18 months in the state of Maryland. There are a lot of cooks in the kitchen in the state of Maryland just to design and permit, and another 12 months to build it. So you're at about 4 years. And that entire time, you're expending time, and there is capacity that's required to get to that endpoint. Now, if we go to the other parts of the pie chart, which are cost and logistics, well, we developed a cost 4 years earlier, and that cost needs to hold 4 years later when we go to put a shovel in the ground. And if anybody knows anything about recent activities in Baltimore City, a large container ship hit the Key Bridge, took the bridge down to the water, and cut off the truck route that our good friends at EQR were going to use to move the sand from the quarry to the site. So again, we're talking about increased costs and the logistics of how we're going to get it there. So I think what all this underwrites is the complexity of just one project, and this is certainly not the biggest of the BRIC projects that have been awarded or the most complex, and what it really takes to move these things down the road from an idea to an implemented project.
Yeah, and I know we keep talking about this one BRIC application, but despite all of the time and the effort that it took to put it together, it was such an important piece of the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative because it was the first big piece of federal funding that we received for the project, and it helped us leverage several other funding sources and gain momentum so that we could keep getting funding and keep expanding the project more and more.
Including a tremendous amount of support from the federal delegation, which really helped in future grant-making efforts at the state level, including the patronage, the generous patronage of our partners from Maryland Department of Environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So before we turn it over to our panelists, Brett, could you take us through some of the ways that the private sector can play a role in addressing some of these challenges?
Yeah, I think what I'll do is just set the stage, and then we'll get into the panel discussion. And when I think about what the private sector can bring to the table, I really put it in 3 different buckets. We drive innovation And this can be anything from procurement to innovative contract writing. One of the more important things is that we're willing to accept performance-based risk and financial liability, and we'll talk about that as it relates to cash flow on some of these reimbursable grants, and especially on something as large as a $33 million grant. We bring efficiency to the table, so we are looking to move efficiently, to bring the most cost-effective, high-quality, durable projects to the table, and then we want to get those projects into the ground because for the private sector, time is money. Having one single entity, manage a program of this scale, and Brad can either support this or not support this, but it brings a lot of efficiency to the table. It has helped increase Brad's capacity, and we are very dedicated to moving this program forward and managing it. And then there's this idea of capacity multiplication. And of course, Brad is our eligible entity for all of this grant funding, and we have a number of partners. Some of our partners are actually in the audience today who have helped to multiply that capacity to address both the time and the capacity function on the pie chart we shared a little while ago.
Yeah.
Should we move into some questions?
Yeah, we're gonna have a bit of a dialogue with our panelists and then move into audience questions and answers. So I think to start out, we'd just like each of our panelists to discuss some of the challenge that they see to mobilizing this funding and what some of the potential solutions could be. So we'll just start going down the line and then we'll see where the conversation takes us. So, Liam.
Great. Sure. Well, I think starting from the industry perspective, with my industry trade group hat on, I would say that communication as to what these projects do, what the benefits are, helping the public understand the value in both these innovative contract mechanisms, the resilience, and the purpose of that, and what that actually is. I think those of us in this room probably understand what that means, but most folks outside this building don't really understand what that is and what the costs and benefits are. So I think as an industry that wherein a lot of the expertise lies, it's incumbent upon us to do a better job in communicating that to the public, to what the costs and benefits are. Because as you can see from what you guys had just put out very well and articulately on a slide, it's a very complex, very long-term endeavor to put something like this together. And we're lucky at Middle Branch that Brad is such a great communicator and has done such a great job engaging the community. But I do think it's a challenge for the industry at large to do more and better communication, along with adapting to these contractual mechanisms, these grant processes that are very long-term processes, very complex. So I think in general we need to do a better job as an industry in that regard. As a contractor myself, I think the biggest challenge here is we sort of have to put away our dartboard and get our crystal ball out, because as Brett mentioned, these grants require committing to a cost 4 years before the project is complete, and a lot happens in those 4 years. And as a contractor, in helping to process all of that risk and that what happens over time, we have to have a pretty good imagination about what could happen. The bridges falling and whatever else, inflation. Over the past few years, there's real challenges that have to be addressed in the guidance and the estimates that we provide to our partners in that process. So I think that's probably the biggest challenge from a contracting perspective, is that you really have to be creative, think ahead, and process that risk, communicate how you're processing that risk in a way that everybody and this whole team understands.
Yeah, from a government relations perspective, something unique about these projects first of all, you're going to need to have a local partner, a governmental partner, but you're not responding to an RFP in most circumstances. This isn't something that they've asked for, it's something that you've brought to them. And that, for good reason, comes with some skepticism on their part. So you really need to explain how the project that you're proposing meets many objectives that they otherwise have, and then also meets objectives that the state and federal government expect of them as a local governmental entity, and then also let them know of the funding sources that you're bringing to bear to solve their problem. And so it requires a very nuanced and steady communication with them that doesn't scare them off. Because you all might expect that local governments, when they're hearing this, they're thinking someone's trying to sell them a monorail and run off with all of their money. So you need to make sure that you have the background of someone like Brad Rogers or an entity like GreenVest that has experience and also case studies to say this is what we've done in other jurisdictions and this is what we can do here. Paired with that is a skepticism of the private sector being able to do anything better than what our public works can do. This is a great project. Thank you for identifying these funding sources. We're now going to have the Bureau of Public Works, the Department of Public Works do it despite being grossly understaffed and having never accomplished one of these projects before. So it really is just a matter of educating them on it. And as an industry, you all have great opportunity to advocate on what's been done in other jurisdictions. And I think that this project in particular, as you go back to wherever you're working, you can refer to these slides and this presentation to say just what's possible, but you are going to have to overcome some skepticism on the front end.
Tom's totally right. And really with everything always comes down to deal structure, right? It's either you can put together a group of people who are aligned towards an outcome or not. So I work for a governmental body. We're an economic development authority. I'm eligible to go get these funds, but not able on my own to put together the resources and expertise to get those funds. It would be, and I don't want to spend vast amounts of money in the hopes that I might get those funds, because if I don't get those funds, my board will yell at me and tell me that I've been wasting money chasing windmills. Meanwhile, we've got the private sector who is eager to work on these projects and to pull together these transactions, but they've got a problem, which is that one, they're not always willing to work on spec, but if they were willing to work on spec, which is great, and I'm in favor of it, how do they know that they're going to get the deal at the tail end? Because you'd have to have a procurement for working on spec, and then guarantee in that procurement that you get to work on the final project, and that's a weird dynamic. And who offers that? And it turns out I offered that. And so what we did is we came up with this model for the implementation partner, which is something that you could devise the scope of work around, that started from going after these projects, often on spec, landing them, going through the design process, going through the permitting process, going through all the different negotiations with the community, and then actually building and then maintaining and monitoring them. And what that long scope of contract allows, it allows the private sector to make rational choices about investing in spec applications on the front end and reducing cost and putting in all of Meg's time on the front end, because there's not just one, but potentially a pipeline of projects coming out of it. And so we have an implementation partner, not for this one site, but for all the sites, for the end goal, for victory, for achieving the Middle Branch Resiliency Initiative, which could in the end be $200 million worth of work. And you've got a strong, and that was done by virtue of a public solicitation. So I didn't just tap Brett and say, you're with me now, no bid contract, let's go do this. I wrote it out, after we had talked, we had, known one another, but I put it all out there. I said, this is what I'm trying to achieve in terms of a public-private partnership to achieve an entire $200 million transformation of the shoreline. Anyone can bid on it. We got multiple bidders. It turned out that GreenVest, on their merits, through an appropriate scoring process, won the right to be our implementation partner. And then suddenly we've got a deal structure where everybody's incentives are aligned. We both want to apply for as many as we can and as much as we can. And we want to build as much as we can. And because our relationship is a turnkey delivery model, my risk is limited because I'm agreeing to do they're agreeing to do a certain amount of scope of work for a certain price for each project we do. And so I have certainty as a governmental official that I'm not doing just like a cost plus endless contract, which turns it into a $3 billion project. Meanwhile, their incentives are aligned because they're at risk, and so they want to keep the costs down, and they want to earn the right to have then they want the project to succeed, because if we only get through 3 of these wetlands and it falls apart, we never get to the next 10. So everyone has an incentive to figure out how to get the project to work. And they don't have to worry that someone else is going to come in and piggyback on their hard work, teeing up what's now $67 billion worth of work, and come in and try and do a low bid contract or one of these, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, I can do it for cheaper, but I really won't, and I'll, and you'll only find out about that after construction has begun. We've got a good partnership which is all aligned around the big picture goals, and that allows us also to really be able to align the engineering work, the design work, the green restoration work and resiliency work with the social goals of what we're trying to accomplish. How do we make sure this is a recreational resource? How do we make sure this is an environmental justice outcome? How do we make sure that we're tying this to economic development goals at the community level? That's all possible because I don't have 57 different vendors, each doing one little tiny piece, and each of whom is trying to offload the cost of, and doesn't want to go to one extra meeting because it's not in their scope. We're in this for the long term. We're going to do $200 million worth of work, and I'm telling you, we've got, in addition to the funds we've raised, we have $130 million worth of applications in the pipeline waiting to be heard back from. So we are, the deal structure unlocks this real public-private partnership where everybody is incentivized to achieve the end outcome we all want, because we didn't break the whole thing up into 5 billion little procurements, each one of which took 9 months, and by the time you pick somebody, it's too late and the grant is gone.
I'm not sure I follow that. I'll say a couple things quick. So I'm the state government employee up here. So I think that part of the issue in accessing the funding is state government, probably. That's one of the issues, is the pace at which we move and the federal government moves. A lot of our funding is coming from EPA. So EPA is passing the funding down to us, and then we're typically passing the funding down to a local government. So you have 3 levels of government with government efficiencies built into all 3 levels of government, which definitely can be a hindrance to either accessing the funding or accessing the funding in a timely manner. So we are cognizant of that, and we do our best to expedite what we're doing, but that is for sure an issue, and hopefully we'll improve that, but it's going to continue to be some level of issue no matter what on these projects, I think. The second issue is some of the programs that exist, like in particular for me, the Clean Water SRF program, State Revolving Fund program, historically hasn't funded a lot of green infrastructure projects. It just isn't something that program has done. It's been a lot more focused on the existing infrastructure, gray infrastructure, wastewater treatment plants, sewer pipes, things like that. So getting a program that's been very focused on that to pivot and to start to fund green infrastructure work is a change. It's totally allowed. Different states can do this, but it's just not been something states have been doing. So in Maryland, it is something we're starting to do, and we did have a legislation passed, Conservation Finance Act, that amended state law that really pushed us in the direction of funding more green infrastructure. And so now we're making changes to our programs to make sure that we're able to fund and give green infrastructure co-equal opportunity to get the funding that we have, which is why we're up here, because this project has been able to access 3 different pots of funding from us, given the changes we've made to kind of how we score projects and how we administer our funds. And the last thing I'll say is, even once you get through that process and get selected, and we're living this right now, then there's existing processes you have to go through and people that have been doing things certain ways. And to be the first is always fun. So, working through our existing agreements and procurement reviews and all that kind of stuff with a project that's doing things differently can be difficult. I think in the end we get there, but it just, it becomes difficult to work through that. Hopefully it will be we'll institutionalize the improvements that we make through this process so that we can continue to do this in the future for additional projects as well. But those are all 3 very real challenges I see for for us in Maryland, but also other similar programs in other states.
Yeah, and I'll kind of just tee up like a lot of things that everyone has already said. So if it's not clear already, these grant programs are extremely, they're honestly like a heavy lift. The local capacity is just not there. Everyone here has said how much time and energy it takes to submit these applications, let alone an innovative effort or an innovative project. The capacity for that just really isn't there. That is a really valuable component of this partnership. There's a lot of expertise that you guys have that you can bring to the table to local jurisdictions to apply for these fundings. They do need your help because they can't do it on their own, truly. So the capacity, really, the partnerships, and then mentioning that the application process is really just, it's a lot. A lot of people don't apply for funding, again, because they don't have the capacity to do the work that it takes because, as folks have mentioned, you go through all this work for the grant process, and then at the end, you might get the application. So for folks that don't have the time and capacity to do a great application, let alone a bare bones application, it really just isn't successful most of the time, and so it's really discouraging for people that don't have that. In addition, we've also talked about all of these like innovative efforts. And one of you gentlemen just said like it is tough, Jeffrey, I think you just mentioned it. It's tough being the first one. And Brett had mentioned earlier that like there have been some changes just with MDEM and South Baltimore Gateway Partnership as a sub-applicant that we've had to do legally with like our sub-award agreements. This is different. This is new. And it's hard being the first one doing it. It takes more time than we would like. But we have to kind of push the boundaries to figure out what does this look like? How can we make these innovative efforts work? So not only is that happening at the state level, but like Jeffrey said, it's also happening at the federal level. BRIC was designed for innovative project efforts, but FEMA doesn't know what that looks like, and they don't know how to adjust their standard processes to be able to accommodate innovative projects like that. So you have to be able to, again, have the capacity to push up against these funding sources and say, here's a really great innovative effort. You might not know how to really make this work yet, but let's work together and see where we can kind of adjust the current processes and make this work. But again, that's a lot of effort to do. But with both of these teams, the South Baltimore Gateway Partnership and GreenVest, again, it all rolls back to capacity. They've had the capacity and the effort to be able to push these boundaries that people really haven't seen before. And hopefully it'll just be the start of many, but that is something that we're really coming up against with these innovative efforts.
Thank you, Jesse. Jesse, I wanted to just touch on something that you said. And I think in this industry, we've all seen that the science advances much more quickly than the regulations, right? And the regulations need to evolve, and to an extent they have evolved, and that's kind of episodic, right? And I think what you're saying, Jesse, on the procurement side, we're kind of seeing the same thing, right? So process needs to evolve, and procurement needs to evolve, and contracting methods need to evolve. And, you know, I think that Tom and Jeff touched on it a little bit, and could even touch on it a little bit more. I mean, what is the lag time between a new piece of legislation like the Conservation Finance Act? And Tom, you know how long it took to put something like that together, how many legislative cycles it had to go through to be enacted, and now it's Jeff's wonderful responsibility to try to implement that. You know, and how do you do that in real time? You know, and I think as a private sector practitioner, one of the most interesting things and exciting things about the Conservation Finance Act is that it really promotes pay for success and pay for performance and the models that we're talking about. But it's going to take years before it's, you know, to the point where it gets implemented. So I don't know if you guys want to talk about that a little bit, but I found those points to be interesting.
Since I was on a call this morning at 9:30 with the Procurement Improvement Council, I'll go first. I mean, it really does come down to things like, you know, procurement and getting into the details on procurement, you know, that can be mind-numbing, honestly, to work through. But So legislation passed, like Brett was saying, the Conservation Finance Act, which it took a few years to get through, and build the support necessary to kind of like beat back some of the skepticism around the idea that the state really should be looking at more pay for performance type outcome-based procurements in the environmental. So the bill impacts all the environment-related agencies. So in the environmental space. And to get us all moving in innovative ways toward funding green infrastructure. So I'm not going to unpack the whole bill because there's a lot in it, but it really is, there are a lot of groups involved, restoration companies, some environmental groups, some local governments, a whole entire support network to get the bill through. And in the end, it ended up being, I think, unanimous, but it took a while to get there. And that set the framework, right? So there's a framework in Maryland for promoting these types of projects, these types of procurements, these outcomes-based solutions. But now the state agencies are tasked with making that a reality, right? And so that's the level we're living in now. We have some initial programs kind of going, like the Clean Water Commerce program that we run at MDE, and DNR, Department of Natural Resources, is doing a kind of similar type of pay-for-performance program over there. At the moment, these are kind of one-off pilot programs that are happening. They're not really very large-scale typical procurement. So that's where we're trying to get to, and where I'm spending some time now working with the procurement people in state agencies to try to get them to help us put together the procurement documents we need to do this type of procurement. Like, they're trying to put us in a box of a regular procurement on these things, and we keep saying, you can't do that. This is not going to work the way a typical procurement works, and we need you, the procurement professionals, to work with us to develop the agreement documents, to develop the RFP documents, all the things that we need to have a successful procurement where we're purchasing outcomes from the procurement versus a typical procurement. So it is going to be a little while still, I think. MDE's kind of raised our hand and said we'll be the volunteer guinea pig to go through this process and identify a program that typically may not go through a pay-for-performance type procurement, and try to go through it and see what it's like right now to get where we do a traditional procurement and do it as a pay-for-performance, identify the barriers to that, and hopefully develop the right templates and potentially identify even additional legislative changes that might be needed to better clear the path for these types of projects.
And to build off of what Jeff said, you know, with these programs, particularly with new legislation, you're going to run into a lot of, we don't do that, or that's not how we do it, or we can't do that, which is really where folks with my work come into play, because either you need to deal with the department heads, or you need to go back to the lawmakers that adopted this legislation and have them get engaged and say, yes, you didn't do that before, which is why we adopted this legislation, and I need you to implement it. So you need, it is not going to be as simple as completing a grant application, not that that is simple, and then doing the work. It is going to take bringing people together and acknowledging that this is an innovation, acknowledging that this is new, but then also doing it in as fast as government can work. And it's great to have partners like Jeff within government who understand that these programs are new and need to have procurement, because ultimately that's where this all comes down to. You know, we always end up banging our heads against the door of a procurement officer who's saying, this is my form that I use for all of these things, you need to use this form, and everybody else saying, we can't use that form, it's not going to work in this circumstance. So, yeah.
Can I give an example of that? This is something that Jesse's going to be very familiar with. I have to say, practically speaking, for the folks in this room, your only choice is to smash into the wall of this stuff. There is no like magic wand that you can wave, and it's going to be very specific and unique every single time until there's so many holes in the wall that suddenly that's the archway that everybody's driving through. So you just kind of get prepared for it. Even with the best partners working with you, we had this. For me, one of my big concerns is if I got hit by a bus tomorrow, who would be taking care of all this nature-based infrastructure? One of the things that we work to do is ensure that part of our assumed cost for the entirety of the project would be an endowment fund, which would generate a certain amount of revenue, which would pay for the long-term maintenance and monitoring of the facilities. Very reasonable, rational thing to do. But when it came to actually contracting for the FEMA grant for this purpose, they said, well, this is a problem because we actually can't fund anything that is spent after the period of performance. Once construction is done, we need you to bill for everything, and we can't fund anything that is being, where work is being done after the fact. We said, well, we'll just bill you before work is done. We'll set up the endowment, no problem. They said, no, because the work is going to be done after the endowment, after the period of performance. We can't, like you just said, my form doesn't allow me to do that. And I was like, wait a minute. So if you gave me money to build a house, the house came with the roof, and the roof had a 30-year warranty on it, we would not be allowed to install the roof because someone might come back after the period of performance? Like, no, construction warranty we can get. I was like, well, what if we just had a perpetual lifetime warranty on the product? And they're like, oh, that's great. Just move that from this category, put it on this part of the form, and it'll be no problem. So it turned out to be just fine, but it took 90 days of conversation to get to that point. I used to say that not to berate FEMA or MDEM or even the people involved in the, just that every single time it's going to be making up from scratch until everything that can be made up from scratch has been made up, and then suddenly there's a tunnel to drive through.
Thanks, Brad. So I think one of the common themes that each of you touched on was communication, collaboration, coordination, education, these 4 elements that are very, very important. So Liam, can you put your Chesapeake Watershed Restoration Professionals hat back on, and we can talk again about logistics and time. And I just think it's an important thing to get out there because there has been perhaps a lack of education or a lack of recognition that certain nature-based solutions and certain practices that are capable of or do generate real resiliency are more problematic, or they're causing more problems or more harm than good. And this is yet another obstacle that we're facing. I think at this point it's pretty unique to the Chesapeake Bay States. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear as to whether or not it's happening in other parts of the country. I don't think it's a problem in Texas or some other places where the need for nature-based resiliency is better understood, perhaps. Or
Right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting part of this. I mean, we have seen certainly resistance to stream restoration in Maryland, and quite vociferous opponents to stream restoration as a practice. I think that it really is only a matter of time before there's resistance to other types of nature-based solutions, because the essence of what we're doing is we are reconstructing something, we're rebuilding it for a benefit that accrues over a very long time horizon. But in the near term up front, there are some impacts that happen immediately on the ground that people feel and see. And especially when there are trees involved, or maybe there's an existing amenity for the community that is impacted, they're naturally, if folks don't understand that long-term benefit, they don't understand how that benefit accrues over a very, very long time, they might be against it. And so we've seen that certainly in Maryland stream restoration. It's been a little bit of an uphill battle in catching up in communicating these benefits to the community in an effective way. It's become very political, and I would say, again, as I said in my introduction, I think as an industry, we need to step up together and do a better job of explaining, here's what's going to happen on the site 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years from now, and why that is important, for this community, for the generations to come. And yes, there's going to be some dust, that some trees will come down, they'll grow back. And that there are going to be short-term impacts that we're going to absorb and we're going to move through. But certainly I feel like in our culture there's a whole NIMBY element out there, and I joke there's also a banana element. Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything, which we've heard those voices loud and clear now, and I think now as an industry we need to get together a little bit more effectively and communicate.
I just didn't want to miss an opportunity to sort of bring that to the attention of folks in this forum.
Sure.
Because it's something that we all face as an industry. It's hard enough to, find these projects, find money for these projects, design them, permit them, get them in the ground. And then this kind of opposition can be incredibly distracting. I know that at least 3 of the people sitting up here spent a tremendous amount of time during this year's Maryland legislative session. I see some other folks in the audience who spent an equal amount of time dealing with these things rather than doing the good work that we all do. So that's probably a good place to put a pin in it and go to the audience for questions and answers.
Yeah. I think we have someone walking around with microphones.
Hi, I'm Ann McEnany from the Alumbra Innovations Foundation, and as of foundation, I'm curious if there is any point in the process in which a flexible grant or sort of pre-development funding would have been useful in accelerating to get you where you needed to go, building capacity, for example. And then my second part question is, the PPP program during the pandemic was so incredibly effective at getting money to the ground. Is anyone anywhere studying that to process mapping that, to figure out how to do that in other places with the federal government to unlock some of that capital?
Those are both very, very good questions. I know Brad's chomping at the bit to answer the
Yeah,
first
I'll take
question.
the first one because I don't know anything about the second one. So absolutely, and in fact, as I mentioned very briefly earlier, my principal source of funding is actually casino revenues. When slot machine gambling was legalized in Maryland, the law said that a fraction of the revenues generated by slot machines had to come back to local neighborhoods. So we receive several $1 million a year in casino funds, and all of that flexible, non-reimbursement based money is exactly what we used to do lots of community engagement. We did years and years of community planning. We built a whole reimagined middle branch plan that where every community's needs were referenced in that plan. My money now goes towards community grants to local nonprofits, senior programs, youth programs, economic development, all the things that naturally have to go alongside and engage with the nature-based resiliency infrastructure in order for it to achieve all of its co-benefits. So absolutely, that type of funding is really critical. And in our case, it was essential to essentially create the social and political reality on the ground where the communities realized that's our waterfront that's been denied to us for generations. We want it back. Go out and get that money and build that stuff for us. And when you build it, here's what we want it to look like. Here's what we want it to do. And here are the youth programs that we want to be able to play there. And so I absolutely agree that you can't limit yourself, particularly in a disinvested urban environment. You can't limit yourself just to funding for the infrastructure, period, full stop.
That's a great answer, Brad. It doesn't, I mean, one of the things that we didn't touch upon is when you have, $67 million worth of projects you need to put in the ground, and you've aggregated all sorts of grant funding, and most of that grant funding is reimbursable. What do you do while you're holding your breath and eating ramen for weeks before you get paid, right?
Right. So I recommend you become friends with this guy. So there's two answers to that. One, we are using our own. We're very lucky to have our own revenue stream, and so we're able to use that to cover cash flow. But more seriously, when Jeff had talked earlier about the State Water Quality Revolving Loan Fund being something that traditionally funds a wastewater treatment plant, and now it pivoting to being able to work in green infrastructure, the first thing that we have come to that fund for support with would be a loan to help us cover the cash flow so that we can get the money from Jesse so we can build the project and then return it back to Jeff. And so that's that type of loan product is actually incredibly valuable in this space as the projects scale up to the point where they are of comparable capital cost to a major new stormwater facility or a major new waste treatment facility?
Thank you, Brett. I'm not sure exactly how to answer the P3 question. Tom,
No, they had some follow-up questions about what was the loan.
Yeah, so every state calls it a little bit different, but the EPA Clean Water State Revolving Fund is the fund that my group manages. And I'll just say just to chime in quickly, the pre-development funds, I think that is an issue because there are communities that I think could use pre-development funds, foundation funds in particular, to get them to the point that they can apply. So I think that is for sure an issue that we see and are struggling with. So I kind of would want to talk to you more about that afterwards, if possible.
So the other question was related to the COVID relief grants and whether any lessons were learned. Unfortunately not. I mean, what we saw from that is that a lot of the presumptions of waste, fraud, and abuse of these grants that required all of this follow-up and oversight and receipts, and that was not doing much to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. It was preventing people from seeking funds that they otherwise would have sought. But unfortunately, once the emergency was over, all of those things came back into place. And I would say that on the whole, and maybe Meg can address this point, but there has not been any liberalization of access to grant funds in a way that's all that meaningful. It's just been back to the status quo.
Hello, Arthene Cossey Van Dyne from Waterfunder. It sounds like the program that you guys were describing was very similar to the EPA's community-based public-private partnership programs that were originally designed for green infrastructure. And I'm wondering if there's any kind of fast learning or collaboration that can help if you look at that program to help facilitate conversations at the state and federal level.
Jeff, you want to take that one?
I don't know what that program is. What's the program? I'm not familiar with that one.
The EPA has a program called Community-Based Public-Private Partnerships, where it is exactly a pay-for-performance program that's designed where you have one partner who helps design and implement the program, and they are the ones that go out and find the rest of the community-based organizations and programs that help fulfill the solution, and that it becomes one procurement point for the program to do all of the pieces, so it makes it really easy for the programs to happen. And it was specifically designed for green infrastructure implementation. So to also start with, let's do some pilots first to find out what needs to work and what can work in that community, and then the community can pick which ones that they want to continue to procure going forward.
Jeff, why don't I jump in on that question a little bit? I think Maryland's, I mean, every state is unique. And I think the state of Maryland is already ahead of the curve as it relates to embracing innovative public-private partnerships and innovative methods of procurement. And I've worked in other states where that might benefit if the state wants to listen to the EPA and try to benefit from the wisdom that the EPA can bring forward. I mean, New Jersey is one of those states where I've worked for a very long time. New Jersey has not really embraced that model as it relates to public-private partnerships, at least at the same level that the state of Maryland has. But I think it comes down to how a state jurisdiction might relate to the EPA region that they're in and the folks at that EPA region. I mean, we're very fortunate in EPA Region 3. We have a very, very good relationship with the administrator of EPA Region 3. He has thrown a lot of resources at our program. I don't know, Tom, did you want to jump in and comment on that? Or Brad, did you look like you had something to say?
I'm not actually familiar with that project in particular, but I can just say that, speaking from my experience, there is a cultural change that needs to happen in terms of the way in which large funders, whether they're philanthropic or governmental, approach those community-based programs. There is generally and you can understand why, for all kinds of rational reasons, there's this sort of nonprofit industrial complex of trusted partners, and so resources flow to those partners and then never end up integrating into the communities themselves. It becomes sort of like we parachute in, we drop off a bunch of bags of rice, we helicopter out, we've done our share kind of model, and I'm really glad to hear about that as a new approach, because that's exactly the type of thing that needs to happen in order for distressed communities to become increasingly autonomous, increasingly capable of resolving their own concerns, increasingly capable of driving their own change. What we do significantly particularly with the casino funds that we manage, is we have contracts to pick up the grass, contracts to run youth sports programs, contracts to organize major festivals, and most of those contracts are given to local grassroots community partners, and that requires a degree of two things simultaneously: a degree of trust and risk tolerance, where you're willing to be the first one in to give a $100,000 grant to a youth sports program that has, it's been operating on donations for 30 years, and suddenly they've got real resources. But it also takes a relationship built on trust and mutual respect with those organizations, so that one, you can know who to trust, and two, when you can tell them, in order to get this money, this is the paperwork burden you're going to face. You're going to need to be able to show receipts. You're going to need to have QuickBooks. You're going to need to have things that you never had to do during a time when you were running all on volunteer energy. So that type of space is critically important, and so I'm very enthusiastic about it. But it requires a real change, a forward-leaning position for the funding entity, or for the the administering entity, because you have to get out of your comfort zone of working only with the big, large partners can have full-time staff to work on these funded projects. Okay.
Jeremy Kozer with JMT. Excellent presentation. Thanks everybody. You mentioned this is pay for success contracting. What does that look like? And what I mean by that is, what is the process, the negotiation of what those terms of success are going to be based on all these wonderful goals and objectives? It's very mind-blowing to try to track all those, but then also in the context of an innovative, maybe out-of-the-box project that we don't have those performance standards written.
First of all, Jeremy, you said you weren't going to ask any hard questions, so we'll do the best that we can to answer it. So let's unpack it in this way. I think we talked about pay for performance and pay for success, and those are two slightly different things. And then you talked about success metrics, and so those are really three different things. So I think what we're dealing with here is I would put it in the pay for performance bucket instead of the pay for success bucket. Slightly different things. So when we're performing as South Baltimore Gateway Partnership's implementation partner, we have a set of milestones that we have to achieve that are based on the evolution of the project. So from site acquisition, through design, through engineering, through permitting, through construction, and then into maintenance and monitoring. And I think we borrowed from the 404 space, and we created a long-term management endowment where one was not required, but we're spending a lot of money in the public trust on publicly owned land to build green infrastructure that we want to be there for a very long time. So we all felt it was very important to create the long-term management endowment that could then be leveraged to provide maintenance over a very long period of time. As you well know, it's a negotiation process once we get into it. And although performance standards for a wetland, a tidal wetland, should be the same, whether that tidal wetland is being put in the ground to satisfy a 404 mitigation requirement, or it's generating water quality benefit, or it's generating community resiliency. That is not the case, and I think everyone in this room who's had any experience with any of those three things would know that answer. And because it's new and because we're reestablishing habitat in an ultra-urban environment that hasn't been there for 200 years, we're now being subject to a whole other set of performance standards. And those performance standards are really negotiated through the design and permitting process. And your friend Chris, sitting right next to you, helped to design these, and he probably aged 5 years during the process. Because in Maryland, the Joint Evaluation Committee is comprised of at least 8 different agencies, and they all have their own opinions about how something should look and how something should perform, and they kind of get their hands into the design. So I think where we started was something that was very innovative. The regulatory agencies wanted something more conservative that they could hang their hat on, that they felt would be there and for the long term. And then because we're dealing with a program, up front, we had to agree to a monitoring program that spanned a huge area of the outer harbor of Baltimore to try to set a baseline condition that hadn't really been set by anybody else. So I think in this case, we had to agree to monitoring a very large area. We had to agree to certain biological performance standards that I think we're still uncomfortable with, but we'll build the field of dreams and we'll hope that they come. And then we had contamination issues to deal with, right? So we had historic contamination. It's a very industrial area in the outer harbor. It's been intensively used for 300 years. And we have contamination at depth. And the resource agencies, I think, were extremely concerned that when we went in and loaded up the sediment and converted open water back into marsh, that we were going to squeeze contaminated sediment from depth up through the superficial layers. So then we had to agree to put in activated carbon. And no one has done that in this application in the state of Maryland. So that was new. We were uncomfortable with that, but we agreed to it because it took us 4 years to get to a point where we actually had a project that we could put in the ground. So the performance standards are evolving over time. There are some standard performance standards. There are some new performance standards. But at the end of the day, GreenVest is going to accept the performance-based risk on behalf of South Baltimore Gateway Partnership. So
There's a whole stacked, I mean, the thing is that each layer of partnership that GreenVest has to have generates its own performance-based risk. So they have to keep me happy, and I've got these lofty visions of transforming Baltimore and making South Baltimore a paradise for the people who live there, and they got to deal with that, even if it's not technically written into our contract that they have to make everything a paradise. Then they've got the actual contractual risk, which is, you get paid based upon these milestones that we have to hit. Then there's the funders who each come in with their own priorities, which are written into the grant solicitation, and then into our promises we make in our grant proposals, and then get written into those agreements. So that they've got their own goals that they're trying to achieve. And when you've got a complex capital stack where you have 87 different funders all funding the same 2-acre wetland, and they all slightly disagree about what the goals are, there's a lot of needle threading to be done. And then you get into the regulatory negotiation where everyone agrees that there should be a wetland, just not what it should be like, how big it should be, where it should be, whether the grass should be on the top or on the bottom, whether it should touch the water at all. Lots of disagreement. And so it is a pervasive challenge where really you have to look at all of those different actors simultaneously and figure out from moment to moment whose needs are you trying to satisfy.
When you frame it that way, I think we want to go back to doing mitigation banks.
Yeah, right.
Brad,
I just wanted to add that on these also, they're talking about re-educating local governments and state governments. There is going to be gravity towards a time and materials contract, and they're going to try to have you convert whatever you propose to them into a time and materials contract, and that is going to be something you need to resist at all costs, and you really just work on convincing them of this model of performance-based, because once it gets converted into time and materials, it's not the same thing, number one, and number two, it also becomes easier for them to say, well, my Department of Public Works can do it instead.
Thanks, Tom. Any more questions?
14 seconds.
I think we did
Wow,
pretty
right on
pretty well
time.
on time. We're right on cue. Well, thanks everybody for coming and listening. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate the opportunity to present.